Good afternoon, everyone. What an amazing turnout today. This is such an important topic. Thank you for being here. I am thrilled to be here with a wonderful group of leaders coming from our partner, Exiger. Everyone, thank you all so much for being with us and supporting today's program. For those who aren't familiar, Exiger is a market-leading supply chain AI company that arms organizations with modern solutions to solve their biggest compliance and risk management challenges. So three key leaders with us here today that I'm excited to introduce to you all. Starting here on the far left, we have Carrie Wibben, president of Exiger. She works with the company's most critical accounts and oversees Exiger government solutions. She's a former U.S. Army officer and served as deputy director of the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, among others. Carrie, welcome.
Thank you.
Next, we have Katie Arrington, Vice President for Government Affairs at Exiger. Before stepping into this role, Katie was the first Chief Information Security Officer for the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment at the DoD. She also served as two-term South Carolina State Representative. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you.
Last but not least, we have Major General Cam Holt, President of Exiger Government Solutions. Major General Holt retired from the U.S. Air Force, where he served 32 years of military service, including 4 years as Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Air Force and Space Force. Major General Cam Holt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, ma'am.
So let's dive in. There is a lot to cover. This is such a critical topic. And Carrie, I want to go ahead and start with you. And I want to approach this in a bit of a two-part question. So at a high level, first, just help us understand the essential role that a strong American supply chain plays in maintaining critical infrastructure in this country. But I would also say beyond just the defense industrial base. The second part of that really is, how do potential issues in those spaces compromise our nation's ability not only to defend itself, but also, as we've all talked about in the lead up to this conversation, how it helps us to compete economically?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'll start by just saying thank you to POLITICO and to all of our partners with honor, industry partners, and certainly government partners and members of Congress. Jeanette left the stage with, one of my favorite things to say and emphasize, that this is a team sport. And it takes everyone that I just mentioned in those organizations and the American people if we're actually going to be effective in countering this threat. I'd like to start by hopefully, show of hands, did anyone catch the China Select Committee hearing today? It was fantastic. It was titled "From High Tech to Heavy Steel, Combating the PRC's Strategy to Dominate Semiconductors, Shipbuilding, and Drones." And I just want to start, kind of set the stage here with, to recite a couple of the opening remarks from Chairman Molinar, because they were incredibly poignant. And he said, "During the Second World War, America was called the arsenal of democracy. While our brave soldiers fought on the front lines, millions of men and women labored on the assembly lines to bury the Axis under a storm of steel. Today, the Chinese Communist Party aspires to become an arsenal of autocracy and represses 1 billion people at home, in providing authoritarian regimes with the means to wage aggression abroad. To do so, the CCP seeks to control the key technologies and critical infrastructure sectors that will determine future conflicts. And our nation and our national task, our mandate is clear. We need to revitalize our domestic industries and those of our allies so we can become an arsenal of democracy once again." So it really set the stage for a fantastic set of expert testimonies today, and I thought was just incredibly well timed for this event. To answer your direct question, you actually heard from the experts just before us who probably gave a way better answer than I could. So I'll kind of defer to their answers on the criticality of this. But I would like to offer a perspective that I think we very uniquely have. So at Exiger, we support the regulators and we support every heavily regulated industry. So we kind of have the full picture of the problem and the challenges and why, frankly, we've not made more progress. And it really boils down to a couple things. And I think the most critical is that the incentives are not right. And the National Security Memorandum 22 that Brandon mentioned, that was in the earlier panel just spoken about, I agree with Brandon. It really, it's an update, but it really didn't move the needle in any meaningful way. And to me, it really highlights the fact that we have so much work left to do. And it will take resourcing, it will take intention, and it will take investment from Congress to the executive branch, to the regulators, but also an incentive structure and a kind of a transformation in the incentive structure to get our critical industry partners to prioritize this investment, to understand who they're doing business with, who's deep in their supply chains, who are those third-party relationships, and what risk does it expose when they're doing business outside of their four walls. So I really think, again, I could talk for days on this and you won't find a group of more passionate people. I will challenge you on the topic, but I'll pause there because I know we've got a lot of ground to cover.
So Cameron, I want to come to you next. We're going to talk a lot about AI a bit later in this conversation, but in your work in the Air Force for acquisition, technology, logistics, I'm certain that you saw a lot of firsthand instances of how important a supply chain really is. And I think, some believe that the U.S. defense supply chains specifically, they're not resilient enough. That contributes to national security fears. So I think the question for you that I have is, do you agree with that assessment? When you worked in the federal realm, what were some of the biggest hurdles and issues that you encountered?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So yeah, I spent 32 years in uniform and primarily as an acquisition officer. But the Air Force did afford me an opportunity to also really study national security policy. And that's where I really started to understand what the Chinese Communist Party was up to. And then late in my career, I was asked to lead a pandemic relief task force for the Air Force, where our job was to shore up the defense industrial base, having been immediately impacted by the pandemic, and also to reshore a lot of the medical manufacturing capability that we had become dependent upon China and India and others for. I will tell you, through those experiences, the two biggest failures that I saw, and I don't want to be insulting, but it really is a failure of imagination, a failure to understand the problem in its full breadth, and also a failure to understand its urgency. And I would say the latter, the former is I think past us now. I think we're beyond a tipping point. Just from looking at the size of the audience here and online is evidence, and the hearing this morning is evidence that we now are coming to grips with the full impact of what the Chinese Communist Party has been doing over decades. The second part, though, I don't think that we are there yet. I have been on the battlefield in several wars. I've participated in preparing for war in the Pentagon, and I will tell you, we are not there yet. I do have hope, but I would tell you that the Chinese Communist Party has really been focused on what America does not see as war, which is economic and information coercion and manipulation in a predatory fashion. And over the decades they've been engaged in that in a very methodical process, we have had great optimism about the idea of globalization, about the idea that if China rises and is economically self-sufficient, that they will see that totalitarianism and repression of populations and oppression is not the way to go. And unfortunately, they took advantage of that optimism, and we are now where we are. I will tell you, though, I don't want to be all the doom and gloom person on the panel here today. I do have great optimism about the future. I do have to be honest about the lack of urgency still, but it's why I'm at Exiger. Exiger allows me to still be on what I believe is the front lines of what I call the silent war. This war is now in our supply chains. It's in access to critical materials. It's in access to critical technologies. And it's not just about IP theft. In some cases, it's cheaper for China to buy the technology than it is for them to steal it. The hearing this morning was very encouraging to talk about shipbuilding and other things. Just one quick statistic on shipbuilding. One of China's shipbuilding yards has the capacity of 230 times the entire shipbuilding capacity of the United States. And they already have a bigger Navy than the United States does. I could quote statistics like that across the board, but at Exiger, we have the ability to change this. And I would cite with Congress and the Department of Defense, with Congress resourcing it and aligning the incentives, as Carrie referred to, with the Department of Defense really getting serious about the urgency, allowing program executive officers of all our weapon system capabilities to dig deep and look deep within their supply chain by aligning those incentives with industry to do so. And then really thinking about utilizing some of these long forgotten defense agencies and their role in this as well, to include the Defense Logistics Agency, Defense Contract Management Agency, as they look horizontally across the problem, just as the PEOs look vertically through the problem. And not just those defense agencies, but the other federal agencies as well can really see the outlines of the Chinese Communist Party strategy and how broad it is. So I have great hope for the future.
We do like the optimism. I will say, so we can put this in perspective of the gap that we have to close, where we're falling behind. Carrie, I want to come back to you briefly. Katie, I'm going to come to you in a moment to dive in a bit more on the regulatory side. But as it relates to these supply chains, we know that they're becoming increasingly interconnected. Large organizations can work with up to 10,000 third parties, which I found really astounding as we were preparing for this conversation together. And just to put that in perspective, Deloitte finds that 65% of executives who lead supply chain and purchasing responsibilities lack visibility past tier 1 suppliers. That seems like a tremendous gap, a tremendous risk. And Carrie, I want to understand from your perspective, why is that? How big of a risk is that lack of visibility?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true, and it's not unique to a single company, a single supplier, a single government agency. We support, again, some of the biggest companies in the world. One of our automotive clients, Nissan, just to kind of emphasize your point in asking the question, said that over 95% of the cost of manufacturing an automobile is from external sourcing, right? So the parts, everything required to actually manufacture an automobile, only 5% is really within their direct control. So, that really makes you think, right? How much of my supply chain do I even control? And then for the 95% in that example that I don't control, where I have complete dependency on third parties, how do I manage that risk? And so the answer, and I'd say the answer to your first part of your question is, why is that? Well, I think there was a reasonable excuse in the past because technology wasn't really as advanced as to what it is now to enable you to have that deep visibility and assess risk at the same time into your third-party ecosystem and your supply chains. That is a very different reality today. And so we, again, why I love being at Exiger, because we are still on the front lines and we are helping these massive defense and aerospace companies, critical infrastructure companies, solve that problem and do it at scale. And in the process, they are actually becoming differentiated from a competitive perspective to their peers. I can't remember who the quote is from, but there's a quote that says, companies aren't actually competing against each other, supply chains are competition. And so I think that really just drives home the point that if you are not investing in tools like ours and other tools, AI, to get that depth of visibility into your sub-tier supplier ecosystem, your third-party ecosystem, and not just knowing who's in it, but then understanding your risk exposure based on that incredible reliance on third parties outside of your four walls, you are not going to continue to be viable. You're not going to continue to be able to withstand very advanced state actor adversarial threats, which we know are pervasive and increasing by the minute. And you're not going to be able to continue to be competitive. So there really is no excuse today, where we sit today. In the past, maybe, but I think the criticality and the fact that technology, I heard an AI question earlier, that's a very different reality today. And I would say, the incentive point is still there. We still need to do a better job incentivizing that behavior, but there's really no excuse.
Katie, I'm really excited to come to you now to help us find all the solutions to all these problems. There's some optimism, but there are some gaps to close. And so I want to understand from your perspective, what are the capabilities that are going to be most essential to combat all of these different issues that we're surfacing? And I would say even specifically within the Department of Defense, and even more broadly, how do we get federal agencies, the federal government, even up to par for where the private sector is?
Wow. Okay. So first and foremost, thank you for being here. And this gentleman represents our war force of the future, right? So acquisition is where it's at. We have a lot of federal acquisition rules and DFAR. They run the Department of Defense and federal agencies. The challenge set that we have is that once a contract is let out, it's people like this, right, that Cameron, bless his heart for doing what he did for so many years. If we don't get the regulatory pieces lined up within the building or within the federal agencies, the ability to share risk, we still, I mean, Jeanette and Brandon were up here, that is still precluding us. But when you use tools like ours, Exiger, which is open source tools, and the availability to show information that's, that the provenance of the data is irrefutable, that is a real thing, that we can share risk openly within the ecosystem of the federal agencies. That's where we need to get to, right? So they have the Federal Acquisition Security Council that was stood up in 2019 to share risk. That is still a challenge set within the federal agencies. I mean, Jeanette talked about it earlier about lawfare. We sue each other because we're afraid of saying something bad. We need to get to a place where we're dynamic in our capability to share information, regulatory, state-wise, because our adversaries do. And as soon as we put out regulation, so we do the 1260 list every year, what do you think our adversaries do? Well, they're masquerading, right? I'm going to use the word masquerading. They pretend they're US-based companies. We come out and we say this company name is bad, and the regulators and the DoD and Congress are all trying to get their arms around it. Meanwhile, China is just changing the name and the source of origin, right? They're moving from country to country. So how do we get regulation in the United States at the dynamic level that we need it to be? And Cameron and I were in the Pentagon together, and that's probably one of the biggest things that we struggled through, was how do we share risk without getting sued? How do we inform the primes who will use the caveat of contract privity? I can't see below the second tier. You have to see all the way down your supply chain. And when, right now we're working on legislation, my partner in the back, Guy Karras, and I work a great deal on the Hill to try and get the regulators to understand, once we put like the Biosecure Act, right? Once we name a company, I think we need to change that conversation to describing the technical assumptions of that company so that we can thwart them before they come into our supply chains. Because the challenge set is, we put a name out of a company, we at Exiger can trace them and say, okay, they're right here. We can see, their infiltration of an ecosystem, and our adversaries are agile, they're well-funded. So moving to a country like Vietnam, or moving to a country like Nicaragua or Mexico or is no problem for them. Where we're stuck in the regulatory binds of when we establish a US-based company and we go through the legal process and we go through all of these things, I liken it to the analogy of our adversaries are playing to win, we're playing to be we're working about risk, and we need to play to win. And Carrie said it earlier, and Jeanette said it before her, this is not one and done. We need DoD. We need both bodies in legislation. We need the White House. But more importantly, we need industry to understand that our adversaries are out to play to win. They are not playing to just have, making more money. Their ideals, as Cameron mentioned earlier about the CCP, we forget about the Uyghur labor force, and most Americans are blithely unaware that there's an entire Muslim population in northern China that is enslaved from birth to death so that we can have comforts and ease. And until we start acknowledging that and figuring out ways to position ourselves through regulation and resourcing, I mean, that's the second biggest problem, is we say it's bad. Everybody here remember 889? NDAA 889, take Huawei and ZTE bad. Well, what didn't we do there? Well, we didn't resource the industry to rip and replace. We just said rip it out. And they're running on profit margins. And the regulators need to understand profit and loss is a real thing. How do we do it in a way that we incentivize our primes to do the right thing, or OEMs, but and don't beat them over the head, because we need them. Our industrial base is based in, I've said this for years, and Cam was in the Pentagon with me as we talk about this ad nauseum. We don't build anything in the Pentagon but policy, bureaucracy, and problems. Am I wrong? But what industry is building is our national defense. And if we're not working with them side by side, the DoD, the regulators, the legislators, and the White House, to create requirements, to fund and resource it, we're never going to get to the bottom of this.
the funding, the resources, the incentives, you've all talked about this a lot. Carrie, I want to pick up with you on that thread. Multiple DoD reports are highlighting that a lot of the medium to small sized businesses that make up the defense industrial base, they don't have the resources. They don't have the money, the cybersecurity expertise necessary to protect sensitive information. So can you talk a little bit more about what resources are needed and help us go a little bit deeper on the type of role a company like Exiger plays?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we're a little short on time, so I'll try to be quick here. But my perspective on this, also from serving in the five walls of the Pentagon, is really from the position of having been the head of counterintelligence and security for all of DoD. So in that role, I had access to all open counterespionage investigations that the FBI had open on DoD, most of that involving IP theft from within the defense industrial base. And I also owned the controlled unclassified information policy for how we start to actually protect and mark information that matters that we need to make sure is not ending up in our adversaries' hands. So my perspective on it is sort of, I think unique, because I saw firsthand, and we mapped with the FBI how our adversaries are stealing our intellectual property. One of the most effective threat vectors they leverage is cyber attacks, right? So when you're talking about mids and smalls, and I'll say 4 years on the other side of the fence here in industry, I view that problem very differently than I did in government. And it's a real problem that we personally, frankly, we were in a very advantageous position because we did have the capital to invest in hardening our infrastructure, putting our system, our platform through FedRAMP accreditation, through impact level DoD accreditation, but it was millions of dollars of investment. The government didn't give us money to do that. We had to be able to invest and make that investment to be able to harden and come up to standard. So I will just say one thing that we're doing. I'm going to kick it to Katie. She's the mother of CMMC. We would be remiss if we didn't mention that. But I give a lot of credit to actually OSD, and one of our partners here, John Gartzka, is launching a cyber poverty line study with us to actually make sure that before we launch off on another triage and effort to write a bunch of regulation and policy, we really deeply understand the problem. And so it's a fact-finding mission around financial health and cybersecurity within the defense industrial base, a very large portion of the 300,000 companies, to make sure that we have a data-driven approach to solving the problem this time around. So that's a little bit about what we're doing. Katie, I don't know if you wanted to mention CMMC.
CMMC, Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, another thing that we did within the Pentagon to help companies do the right thing, right? So companies say that they're instituting the NIST 171. If you don't know what the NIST is, it's the National, wow, I just spaced on NIST. Yes, Standards and Technologies. They have a special publication 171. It's 110 controls that say if you do these things, you're cyber secure. Well, how much does it cost to do that? And hence, if we had the capability of Exiger when I started the CMMC journey, this would be a very different conversation. So I applaud you, John, for leaning in on that one a great deal.
So one of the last questions for our conversation, Cameron, I want to come to you and talk about the topic no one can get off their mind, which is AI. Mm-hmm. And what we know is that AI can actually help someone to map and have full visibility into their supply chain, which seems like an incredible solution given all the risks that you've identified. So talk to us a little bit more. Exiger is really focused on this work. How can AI really transform that visibility?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I'll answer it even in the context of the threat we face too, in keeping with the rest of the theme. A lot of people think about China as having great advantages over us because they're so centrally planned and they can just drive action because they own the companies. And there is no separation between them. They have a national consensus. I would argue that that is a massive weakness. And that the engine of innovation and the private sector motivation in the United States has given us the most formidable military on planet Earth. And we need to not try to match their strategy for trying to beat them. And so what I would say is double down on what made America great. Let the innovation engine take place in the private sector, where it is so rapid. If the incentives are aligned, I will tell you right now, I would assess that our artificial intelligence in the United States is probably a little better than in China, even with all of their investment. Quantum technology, not so. And that is a little worrisome to me. Efforts in space and cybersecurity, the new high ground of 21st century warfare, I would say we're ahead, but the pace of change favors them. So what I would say is, how do we then go faster than they do? They think that our system exhibits weakness. I say it exhibits strength. And so there's a lot of thought process going on in the United States right now, even in the government, about should we do this inside the government like China's doing it? Should we direct all of the resources? Should we tell the private sector what to do and how to do it? Should we build AI engines inside of the Department of Defense that does supply chain risk management or mitigation activities directed centrally? I would say no, resist that temptation. Exiger is so much more capable than we were just 1 year ago with the AI engines that we have. In ingesting 31 million unstructured data sources, over 16,000 structured data sources, premium data sources, and user-provided data to do automatic tipping and queuing in seconds. And our capability 1 year from today will be staggeringly better than it is right now. And so what I would say is, let the private sector do what the private sector does very well. Let our government do what our government does very well. And if we can do that and align the incentives and not see each other as adversarial between industry and government, we will blow the CCP's doors off. No doubt about it.
I think that's a fantastic place to land this conversation. Thank you so much to all three of you. We are out of time, but thanks everyone for being here. This was an incredibly important conversation. We know we've got some gaps, but I do think you all expressed this through a lens of optimism, and the technology that we have today can really close some of those gaps. So thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the program, everyone. Thank you.